Greetings everyone, my name is Gigi and this is Let's Build, wherein I build a Lego set timed to different media and talk about the facts concerning the topic of the build. Today's build is the Lego Lunar Lander versus the video game Outer Wilds. I will not be playing any of the ambient music for copyright reasons. However, a part of the game mechanics does revolve around listening for music cues coming from certain NPCs, so there will be some bits of that sound. The footage I am using from this game is for science and educational purposes. There will also be some light spoilers for the game. I believe that the game is best discovered for yourself, so I'm not going to go in depth in the problem solving for the plot, but you have been warned. Specifications for the Lego set. You were born to explore the universe. Build and inspire the next generation of astronauts with Lego space rockets and vehicles. Let's go. Celebrate man's first moon landing with this Lego creator expert NASA Apollo 11 Lunar Lander building set, developed in cooperation with NASA to mark the 50th anniversary of a historical event that captivated the world. This collectible model features a highly detailed replica of Apollo 11's Eagle lunar module, plus a depiction of the lunar surface, complete with a crater, footprints, and a U.S. flag. The descent stage comes with gold-covered landing pads and panels, opening camera and laser hatches, and a ladder, while the ascent stage has a detailed interior with room for 2 astronauts. Finished with an Apollo 11 lunar lander nameplate, this display model makes a great centerpiece for the home or office and provides a challenging and rewarding building experience full of nostalgia. Includes 2 astronaut minifigures with NASA decoration and golden helmets. Includes 2 astronaut minifigs with NASA decoration and gold helmets. This advanced Lego set features a detailed replica of the Eagle lunar lander with separate ascent and descent stages, plus a depiction of the lunar surface with crater, footprints, and flag. The descent stage features new for June of 2019 gold-colored landing pads and panels, opening camera and laser hatches, and a ladder. Ascent stage features a detailed interior with room for 2 minifigs. Celebrate space exploration with this highly detailed display model. Accessory elements include a brick-built video camera and laser reflector. New for June of 2019 decorated elements include an Apollo 11 lunar lander nameplate and golden elements. Measures over 7 inches high, 8 inches wide, and 7 inches deep. From the instruction manual. The Race to the Moon. Humanity's sense of wonder, fascination, and awe of space is as old as humanity itself. But our desire to explore the universe beyond the realms of Earth did not take flight until the 1960s. Following John F. Kennedy's declaration that America would put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth by the end of the 1960s, NASA led the way, placing the USA firmly at the front of the global race to explore space. Others may have ventured into the vacuum of space, but it was on the 20th of July, 1969, that a human footprint first made contact with the surface of the moon. The landing of the Apollo lunar lander was broadcast live to a global audience. It was a moment that captivated the world and it changed space travel forever. Did you know? It was a lingerie manufacturer who won the contract to develop the spacesuits worn by the crew of Apollo 11. Did you know the craft of weaving by female factory workers inspired the core rope memory of the onboard guidance computer? A pioneering vehicle. A tribute to creativity and innovation, the Apollo 11 lunar lander Eagle was an extraordinary vehicle, representing the first crewed vehicle to land anywhere beyond the Earth, and the vehicle that brought the first man onto the moon. But more than that, the fragile-looking spacecraft represents humankind's curiosity, ingenuity, technological skill, determination, and bravery. It illustrates how creative lateral thinking and perseverance, can bring immense advances for the benefit of all mankind. A tribute to creativity and innovation. This LEGO Creator Expert tribute to the Apollo 11 lunar lander represents something truly astonishing, an authentic human marvel. Even now, over 50 years later, and with the many changes we have experienced in our lifetimes, this vehicle was part of the creative and technological drive to put a human past the comfort zone of our atmosphere. The Apollo 11 lunar lander allowed us to venture into the vast unknown of space and touch down onto the moon, and that is truly astonishing. About NASA. In 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Act was passed, expressing that it is the policy of the United States that activities in space should be devoted to peaceful purposes for the benefit of all mankind. As a result, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was founded over 60 years ago for the purpose of leading the peaceful exploration of space, making discoveries about the Earth, its solar system, and the universe. Since then, NASA research has not only led to the exploration of space, it has made great advances in aviation, helped to develop a commercial space industry, enriched the U.S. economy, created jobs, and strengthened national security. The Apollo program. It was after a series of earlier Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions, as well as the work of thousands of expert scientists, engineers, and astronauts, that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the lunar module on July 20th, 1969, and walked on the moon. The entire program ran from 1961 to 1972 and set several human spaceflight milestones. Apollo 8 was the first manned spacecraft to orbit another celestial body, while the final Apollo 17 mission was the sixth moon landing. The program was not only groundbreaking in terms of space exploration, it catalyzed technological development in avionics, telecommunications, and computers. The Apollo 11 mission key moments. July 16, 1969. Apollo 11, the first manned spaced flight to land on the moon, launched into space. The two astronauts spoke to President Richard M. Nixon from the moon's surface. They spent 2.5 hours collecting samples, setting up equipment, and taking pictures and leaving special items. July 17, 1969. Astronauts Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin Buzz Aldrin made their first TV transmission to Earth from space. July 21st, 1969. After a rest period for the astronauts, the module ascended and returned to Command Module Columbia and docked, reuniting Armstrong and Aldrin with Collins. The lunar lander was then jettisoned into lunar orbit. July 20th, 1969. Armstrong and Aldrin aborted the lunar lander Eagle and disengaged from the Apollo Command Module Columbia. July 22nd, 1969. On the way back to Earth, a mid-course correction and 2 more television transmissions were made. The lunar lander touched down on the moon in the Sea of Tranquility. July 24th, 1969. The Apollo 11 capsule and astronauts on board landed back on Earth, splashing down into the Pacific Ocean. Included is a blueprint of the NASA lunar lander to show what each part of the completed module represents. Facts from the LEGO designer. Lars Joe Helding, design manager specialist. For both the actual lunar lander and our LEGO tribute, blueprints like these are the very beginning of every design process. This is how the design of the original module was translated into LEGO bricks. The golden bricks represent the foil that the lunar lander was wrapped in, for thermal and micrometeoroid protection. The two main elements of the lunar lander are the ascent stage and the descent stage. On the ascent stage, among other things, I focus mostly on the face, with the two windows and the door. The ascent stage has a lot of angles that I had to build in a more simplified way to do the scale. On the descent stage, among other things, I focused on capturing the octagon shape, the legs, and the shiny foil. Did you know? Designed by MIT, the computer on board the lunar lander, the Apollo Guidance Computer, or AGC, provided the guidance, navigation, and control of the spacecraft. The computer's performance was comparable to first-generation home computers available in the late 1970s, but is similar to a simple calculator today. We came in peace. Mankind's initial step on the surface of the celestial object was born out of a race to be the first. The moon landing, made possible by the lunar lander, was a huge achievement for American technological pride and prowess, as well as a tremendous monument for humanity. John F. Kennedy's bold and ambitious call to action did not end with the successful Apollo 11 mission. It set off a new era for NASA and for humanity's exploration of the unknown. NASA's work today still focuses on technological innovation and discovery, pushing boundaries toward human exploration of the Moon and Mars, and reaching beyond to find the answer to the question, are we alone? What was left behind? Many things were left on the Moon after that initial landing by Eagle. Part of the descending rocket for reuniting the astronauts back to Earth, as well as the laser reflector and footprints of the two astronauts, still remain on the Moon. As they also left Apollo 1 mission patch, a memorial bag with a gold replica of an olive branch as a traditional symbol of peace, and a silicon message disc with the goodwill statements of U.S. Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, and messages from leaders of 73 countries around the world. Commemorative medallions were also left on the surface of the Moon. They honor the memories of the Apollo 1 astronauts who lost their lives in a launch pad fire, and 2 cosmonauts who died in accidents. Lunar Lander. A lunar lander or moon lander is a spacecraft designed to land on the surface of the Moon. As of 2024, the Apollo lunar module is the only lunar lander to have ever been used in human spaceflight, completing 6 lunar landings from 1969 to 1972 during the United States Apollo program. Several robotic landers have reached the surface, and some have returned samples to Earth. The design requirements for these landers depend on factors imposed by the payload, flight rate, propulsive requirements, and configuration constraints. Other important design factors include overall energy requirements, mission duration, the type of mission operations on the lunar surface, and life support systems if crewed. The relative high gravity, higher than all known asteroids but still lower than all solar system planets, and lack of lunar atmosphere negates the use of aerobraking, so a lander must use propulsion to decelerate and achieve a soft landing. Some history. The Luna program was a series of robotic impactors, flybys, orbiters, and landers flown by the Soviet Union between 1958 and 1976. Luna 9 was the first spacecraft to achieve a soft landing on the Moon on February 3, 1966, after 11 unsuccessful attempts. 3 Luna spacecraft returned lunar soil samples to Earth from 1972 to 1976. 2 other Luna spacecraft soft landed on the Lunar robotic lunar rover in 1970 and 1973. Luna achieved a total of 7 successful soft landings out of 27 landing attempts. The United States Surveyor program first soft landed Surveyor 1 on June 2, 1966. This initial success was followed by 4 additional successful soft landings, the last occurring on January 10, 1968. The Surveyor program achieved a total of 5 successful soft landings out of 7 landing attempts through January 10, 1968. Surveyor 6 even did a brief hop off the lunar surface. The Apollo lunar module was the first lunar lander for the United States Apollo program. As of 2024, it is the only crewed lunar lander. The Apollo program completed 6 successful lunar soft landings from 1969 until 1972. A 7th lunar landing attempt by the Apollo program was aborted when Apollo 13's service module suffered explosive venting from its oxygen tanks. The LK lunar module was the first lunar lander developed by the Soviet Union as part of several Soviet crewed lunar programs. Several LK lunar modules were flown without crew in low Earth orbit, but the LK lunar module never flew to the Moon, as the development of the N-1 rocket launch vehicle required for the lunar flight suffered setbacks, including several launch failures. And after the first human moon landings were achieved by the United States, the Soviet Union canceled both the N-1 rocket and LK lunar module programs without any further development. After the crew of Apollo 10 named their spacecraft Charlie Brown and Snoopy, Assistant Manager for Public Affairs Julian Schneer wrote to George Low, the manager of Apollo Spacecraft Program Office at MSC, to suggest the Apollo 11 crew be less flippant in naming their craft. The name Snowcone was used for the CM, and Haystack was used for LM in both internal and external communications during early mission planning. The LM was named Eagle after the motif, which was featured prominently on the mission insignia. At Schneer's suggestion, the CM was named Columbia after Columbad, the giant cannon that launched a spacecraft, also from Florida, in Jules Verne's 1865 novel From the Earth to the Moon. It also referred to Columbia, a historical name of the United States. In Collins's 1976 book, he said Columbia was in reference to Christopher Columbus. Landing outcomes. The term landing attempt, as used here, includes any mission that was launched with the intent to land on the Moon, including all missions which failed to reach lunar orbit for any reason. A landing attempt by a spacecraft is classified as full success if it lands intact on the Moon and is situated in its designated orientation or attitude and fully functional, while a partial success occurs when a spacecraft lands intact on the Moon but its in situ operations is compromised as a result of the landing process for any reason. Challenges unique to lunar landings. Landing on any solar system body comes with challenges unique to that body. The Moon has relatively high gravity compared to that of asteroids or comets and some other planetary satellites, and no significant atmosphere. Practically, this means that the only method of descent and landing that can provide sufficient thrust with current technology is based on chemical rockets. In addition, the moon has a long solar day. Landers will be in direct sunlight for more than 2 weeks at a time, and then in complete darkness for another 2 weeks. This causes significant problems for thermal control. As of 2019, space probes have landed on all 3 bodies other than Earth that have solid surfaces and atmospheres thick enough to make aero-braking possible: Mars, Venus, and Saturn's moon Titan. These probes were able to leverage the atmospheres of the bodies on which they landed to slow their descent using parachutes, reducing the amount of fuel they were required to carry. This in turn allowed larger payloads to be landed on these bodies for a given amount of fuel. The lack of an atmosphere, however, removes the need for a moon lander to have a heat shield and also allows aerodynamics to be disregarded when designing the craft. Although it has much less gravity than Earth, the moon has sufficiently high gravity that descent must be slowed considerably. This is in contrast to a small asteroid in which landing is more often called docking, and is a matter of rendezvous and matching velocity more than slowing a rapid descent. Since rocketry is used for descent and landing, the moon's gravity necessitates the use of more fuel than is needed for asteroid landing. Indeed, one of the central designs for constraints for the Apollo program's moon landing was a mass, as more mass requires more fuel to land, required to land and take off from the moon. The lunar thermal environment is influenced by the length of the lunar day. Temperatures can swing between approximately negative 250 to 120 degrees Celsius, which is negative 418 to 245 degrees Fahrenheit, for the lunar night versus lunar day. These extremes occur for 14 Earth days each, so thermal control systems must be designed to handle long periods of extreme cold or heat. Most spacecraft instruments must be kept within a much stricter range of between negative 40 and 50 degrees Celsius, or negative 40 and 122 degrees Fahrenheit, and human comfort requires a range of 20 to 24 degrees Celsius, or 68 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. This means that the lunar lander must cool and heat its instruments or crew compartment. The length of the lunar night makes it difficult to use solar electric power to heat the instruments, and nuclear heaters are often used. Landing stages. Achieving a soft landing is an overarching goal of any lunar lander and distinguishes landers from impactors, which were the first type of spacecraft to reach the surface of the moon. All lunar landers require rocket engines for descent. Orbital speed around the moon can, depending on altitude, exceed 1,500 miles per second. Spacecraft on impact trajectories can have speeds well in excess of that. In the vacuum, the only way to decelerate from that speed is to use a rocket engine. The stages of landing can include: 1. Descent orbit insertion. The spacecraft enters an orbit favorable for final descent. This stage was not only present in the early landing efforts, which did not begin with lunar orbit. Such missions begin on lunar impact trajectory instead. 2. Descent and braking. The spacecraft fires its engines until it is no longer in orbit. If the engines were to stop firing entirely at this stage, the spacecraft would eventually impact the surface. During this stage, the spacecraft uses its rocket engine to reduce overall speed. 3. Final approach. The spacecraft is nearly at the landing site, and final adjustments for the exact location of touchdown can be made. 4. Touchdown. The spacecraft achieves soft landing on the Moon. Touchdown. Lunar landings typically end with the engine shutting down when the lander is several feet above the lunar surface. The idea is that engine exhaust and lunar regolith can cause problems if they were to be kicked back from the surface to the spacecraft, and thus the engine cut off just before touchdown. Engineers must ensure that the vehicle is protected enough to ensure that the fall without thrust does not cause damage. The first soft lunar landing, performed by the Soviet Luna 9 probe, was achieved by first slowing the spacecraft to a suitable speed and altitude, then ejecting a payload containing the scientific experiments. The payload was stopped on the lunar surface using airbags, which provided cushioning as it fell. Luna 13 used a similar method. Airbag methods are not typical. For example, NASA's Surveyor 1 probe, launched around the same time as Luna 9, did not use an airbag for final touchdown. Instead, after it arrested its velocity at an altitude of 3.4 meters, it simply fell onto the lunar surface. To accommodate the fall, the spacecraft was equipped with crushable components that would soften the blow to keep the payload safe. More recently, the Chinese Chang'e 3 lander was used a similar method, falling 4 meters after its engine shut down. Perhaps the most famous lunar landers, those of the Apollo program, were robust enough to handle the drop once their contact probes detected that landing was imminent. The landing gear was designed to withstand landings with engine cutout at up to 10 feet, or 3 meters, of height, though it was intended for descent engine shutdown to commence when one of the 67-inch probes touched the surface. During Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, however, touched down very gently by firing the engine until touchdown. Some later crews shut down the engine before touchdown and felt noticeable bumps on landing with greater compression of the landing struts. Site selection. NASA's Apollo Site Selection Board announced 5 potential landing sites on February 8, 1968. These were the result of 2 years' worth of studies based on high-resolution photography of the lunar surface by the 5 uncrewed probes of the Lunar Orbiter program and information about surface conditions provided by the Surveyor program. The best Earthbound telescopes could not resolve features with the resolution Project Apollo required. The landing site had to be close to the lunar equator to minimize the amount of propellant required, clear of obstacles to minimize maneuvering, and flat to simplify the task of landing radar. Scientific value was not a consideration. The areas that appeared promising on photographs taken on Earth were often found to be totally unacceptable. The original requirement that the site be free of craters had to be relaxed, since no such site was found. 5 sites were considered. Sites 1 and 2 were in the Sea of Tranquility. Site 3 was in the Central Bay. Sites 4 and 5 were in the Ocean of Storms. The final site selection was based on 7 criteria. The site needed to be smooth with relatively few craters, with approach paths free of large hills, tall cliffs, or deep craters that might confuse the landing radar and cause it to issue incorrect readings. Reachable with a minimum amount of propellant, allowing for delays in the launch countdown, providing the Apollo spacecraft with a free return trajectory, one that would allow it to coast around the Moon and safely return to Earth without requiring any engine firings that should problems arise on the way to the Moon, with good visibility during the landing approach, meaning the sun would be in between 7 and 20 degrees behind the LM, and a general slope of less than 2 degrees in the landing area. The requirement for the sun angle was particularly restrictive, limiting the launch site and launch date to 1 day per month. A landing just after dawn was chosen to limit the temperature extremes the astronauts would experience. The Apollo Site Selection Board selected Site 2 with Sites 3 and 5 as backups in the event of the launch being delayed. In May of 1969, Apollo 10's lunar module flew within 15 kilometers of Site 2 and reported it was acceptable. The first step decision. During the first press conference after the Apollo 11 crew was announced, the first question was, "Which one of you gentlemen will be the first man to step onto the lunar surface?" Slayton told the reporter it had not yet been decided, and Armstrong added that it was not based on individual desire. One of the first versions of the egress checklist had the lunar module pilot exit the spacecraft before the commander, which matched what had been done on Gemini missions, where the commander had never performed the spacewalk. Reporters wrote that early in 1969 that Aldrin would be the first man to walk on the moon, and Associate Administrator George Mueller told reporters that he would be the first as well. Aldrin heard that Armstrong would be the first because Armstrong was a civilian, which made Aldrin livid. Aldrin attempted to persuade other lunar module pilots that he should be first, but they responded cynically about what they perceived as a lobbying campaign. Attempting to stem interdepartmental conflict, Slayton told Aldrin that Armstrong would be first since he was the commander. The decision was announced in a press conference on April 14, 1969. For decades, Aldrin believed the final decision was largely driven by the lunar module's hatch location. Because the astronauts had their spacesuits on, and the spacecraft was so small, maneuvering to exit the spacecraft was difficult. The crew tried a simulation in which Aldrin left the spacecraft first, but he damaged the simulator while attempting to egress. While this was enough for mission planners to make their decision, Aldrin and Armstrong were left in the dark on the decision until late spring. Slayton told Armstrong the plan was to have him leave the spacecraft first if he agreed. Armstrong said yes, that's the way to do it. The media accused Armstrong of exercising his commander's prerogative to exit the spacecraft first. Chris Kraft revealed in his 2001 autobiography that a meeting occurred between Gilruth, Slayton, Lowe, and himself to make sure Aldrin would not be the first to walk on the moon. They argued that the first person to walk on the moon should be like Charles Lindbergh, a calm and quiet person. They made the decision to change the flight plan so the commander was the first to egress from the spacecraft. The lunar descent. At 12:52 on July 20th, Aldrin and Armstrong entered Eagle and began the final preparations for lunar descent. At 17:44, Eagle separated from Columbia. Collins, alone aboard Columbia, inspected Eagle as it pirouetted before him to ensure the craft was not damaged and that the landing gear was correctly deployed. Armstrong exclaimed, "The Eagle has wings." As the descent began, Armstrong and Aldrin found themselves passing landmarks on the surface 2 or 3 seconds early, and reported that they were long as they would land miles west of their target point. Eagle was traveling too fast. The problem could have been the mascons, concentrations of high mass in a region or regions of the moon's crust that contains gravitational anomaly, potentially altering Eagle's trajectory. Flight director Gene Kranz speculated that it could have been resulted from an extra air pressure in the docking channel, or a result of Eagle's pirouette maneuver. 5 minutes into the descent burn, and 6,000 feet above the surface of the moon, the LM guidance computer, LGC, distracted, yeah, that's right, distracted the crew with the first of several unexpected 1201 and 1202 program alarms. Inside Mission Control Center, computer engineer Jack Garman told Guidance Officer Steve Bales that it was safe to continue the descent, and this was relayed to the crew. The program alarms indicated executive overflows, meaning the guidance computer could not complete all its tasks in real time and had to postpone some of them. Margaret Hamilton, the director of Apollo Flight Computer Programming at the MIT Charles Stark Drapier Laboratory, later recalled, "To blame the computer for the Apollo 11 problems is like blaming the person who spots a fire and calls the fire department. Actually, the computer was programmed to do more than recognize error conditions. A complete set of recovery programs was incorporated into the software. The software's action, in this case, was to eliminate lower priority tasks and re-establish the more important ones. The computer, rather than almost forcing an abort, prevented an abort. If the computer hadn't recognized this problem and taken recovery action, I doubt if Apollo 11 would have been the successful moon landing it was." During the mission, the cause was diagnosed as the rendezvous radar switch being in the wrong position, causing the computer to process data from both the rendezvous and landing radars at the same time. Software engineer Don Iles concluded in a 2005 Guidance and Control Conference paper that the problem was due to a hardware design bug previously seen during testing of the first uncrewed LM in Apollo 5. Having the rendezvous radar on, so it was warmed up in case of an emergency landing abort, should have been irrelevant to the computer, but an electrical phasing mismatch between two parts of the rendezvous radar system could cause the stationary antenna to appear to the computer as dithering back and forth between two positions, depending on how the hardware randomly powered up. The extra spurious cycle stealing, as the rendezvous radar updated an involuntary encounter, was caused the computer alarms. Landing. When Armstrong again looked outside, he saw that the computer's landing target was in an boulder-strewn area just north and east of a 300-foot diameter crater, later determined to be the West Crater, so he took semi-automatic control. Armstrong considered landing short of the boulder field so that they could collect geological samples from it, but could not since their horizontal velocity was too high. Throughout the descent, Aldrin called out navigation data to Armstrong, who was busy piloting Eagle. Now 107 feet above the surface, Armstrong knew their propellant supply was dwindling and was determined to land at the first possible landing site. Armstrong found a clear patch of ground and maneuvered the spacecraft toward it. As he got closer, now 250 feet above the surface, he discovered his new landing site had a crater in it. He cleared the crater and found another patch of level ground. They were now 100 feet from the surface, with only 90 seconds of propellant remaining. Lunar dust kicked up by the LM's engine began to impair his ability to determine the spacecraft's motion. Some large rocks jutted out of the dust cloud, and Armstrong focused on them during his descent so he could determine the spacecraft's speed. A light informed Aldrin that at least one of the 67-inch probes hanging from Eagle's footpads had touched the surface a few moments before the landing, and he said, "Contact light." Armstrong was supposed to immediately shut off the engine, as the engineers suspected the pressure caused by the engine's own exhaust reflecting off the lunar surface could make it explode, but he forgot. 3 seconds later, Eagle landed and Armstrong shut down the engine. Aldrin immediately said, "Okay, engine stop. ACA, out of detent." Armstrong acknowledged, "Out of detent, auto." Aldrin continued, Mode control, both auto. Descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in. ACA was the attitude control assembly, the LM's control stick. Output went to the LGC to command the reaction control system's jets to fire. Out of detent meant the stick had moved away from its centered position. It was a spring-centered like the turn indicator on a car. Address 413 of the abort guidance system contained the variable that indicated the LM had landed. Eagle landed at 2017 on Sunday, July 20th, with 216 pounds of usable fuel remaining. Information available to the crew and mission controllers during the landing showed the LM had enough fuel for another 25 seconds of powered flight before an abort without touchdown would have become unsafe. But post-mission analysis showed that the real figure was probably closer to 50 seconds. Apollo 11 landed with less fuel than most subsequent missions, and the astronauts encountered a premature low fuel warning. This was later found to be the result of the propellant sloshing before more than expected, uncovering a fuel sensor. On subsequent missions, extra anti-slosh baffles were added to the tanks to prevent this. Armstrong acknowledged Aldrin's completion of the post-landing checklist with "engine arm is off" before responding to Capcom Charles Duke with the words, "Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." Armstrong's unrehearsed change of call sign from Eagle to Tranquility Base emphasized to listeners that landing was complete and successful. Duke expressed the relief at Mission Control. "Roger, Twain. Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." 2.5 hours after landing, before preparations began for the EVA, Aldrin radioed to Earth. "This is the LM pilot. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask every person listening in, whoever and wherever they may be, to pause for a moment and contemplate the events of the past few hours and give thanks in his or her own way." He then took communion privately. At this time, NASA was still fighting a lawsuit brought by atheist Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who had objected to the Apollo 8 crew reading from the Book of Genesis, demanding that their astronauts refrain from broadcasting religious activities while in space. For this reason, Aldrin chose to refrain from directly mentioning taking communion on the moon. Aldrin was an elder at the Webster Presbyterian Church, and his communion kit was prepared by the pastor of the church, Dean Woodruff. Webster Presbyterian possesses the chalice used on the moon and commemorates the event each year on the Sunday closest to July 20th. The schedule for the mission called for the astronauts to follow the landing with 5-hour sleep period, but they chose to begin preparations for the EVA early, thinking that they would be unable to sleep. Lunar surface operations. Preparations for Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to walk on the moon began at 23:43. These took longer than expected, 3.5 hours instead of 2. During training on Earth, everything required to be neatly laid out in advance. But on the moon, the cabin contained a large number of other items as well, such as checklists, food packets, and tools. 6 hours and 39 minutes after landing, Armstrong and Aldrin were ready to go outside, and Eagle was depressurized. Eagle's hatch was opened at 02:39. Armstrong initially had some difficulties squeezing through the hatch with his portable life support system, or PLSS. Some of the highest heart rates recorded from Apollo astronauts occurred during LM egress and ingress. At 02:51, Armstrong began his descent to the lunar surface. The remote control unit on his chest kept him from seeing his feet. Climbing down the 9-rung ladder, Armstrong pulled a D-ring to deploy the Modular Equipment Stowage Assembly, or MESA, folded against the Eagle's side and activate the TV camera. Apollo 11 used slow scan television, incompatible with broadcast TV, so it was displayed on a special monitor, and a conventional TV camera viewed this monitor. Thus, broadcast of a broadcast, significantly reducing the quality of the picture. The signal was received at Goldstone in the United States, but with better fidelity by Honeysuckle Creek tracking station near Canberra in Australia. Minutes later, the feed was switched to the more sensitive Parkes Radio Telescope in Australia. Despite some technical and weather difficulties, black and white images of the first lunar EVA were received and broadcast to at least 600 million people on Earth. Copies of this video in broadcast format were saved and are widely available, but recordings of the original slow scan source transmission from the lunar surface were likely destroyed during routine magnetic tape reuse at NASA. After describing the surface dust as very fine-grained and almost like a powder, at 02:56, 6.5 hours after landing, Armstrong stepped off of Eagle's landing pad and declared, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Armstrong intended to say, "That's one small step for a man," but the word "a" is not audible in the transmission, and thus was not initially reported by most observers of the live broadcast. When later asked about his quote, Armstrong said he believed he said "for a man," and subsequently printed versions of the quote to include the "a" in a square bracket. One explanation for the absence may be that his accent caused him to slur the words "for a" together. Another is the intermittent nature of the audio and video links to Earth, partially because of storms near the Parkes Observatory. A more recent digital analysis of the tape claims to reveal the "a" may have been spoken but obscured by static. Other analysis points to the claims of static and slurring as face-saving fabrication, and that Armstrong himself later admitted to misspeaking the line. About 7 minutes later, after stepping onto the moon's surface, Armstrong collected a contingency soil sample using a sample bag on a stick. He then folded the bag and tucked it into a pocket into his right thigh. This was to guarantee that there would be some lunar soil brought back in case an emergency required the astronauts to abandon the EVA and return to the LM. 12 minutes after the sample was collected, he removed the TV camera from the MESA and made a panoramic sweep, then mounted it on a tripod. The TV camera cable remained partly coiled and presented a tripping hazard throughout the EVA. Still photography was accomplished with a Hasselblad camera that could be operated handheld or mounted on Armstrong's Apollo spacesuit. Aldrin joined Armstrong on the surface. He described the view with the simple phrase, "magnificent desolation." Armstrong said moving in lunar gravity, 1/6 of the Earth's, was even perhaps easier than the simulations. It's absolutely no trouble to walk around. Aldrin joined him on the surface and tested methods for moving around, including two-footed kangaroo hops. The PLSS backpack created a tendency to tip backwards, but neither astronaut had serious problems maintaining balance. Lopping became the preferred method of movement. The astronauts reported that they needed to plan their movements 6 or 7 steps ahead. The fine soil was quite slippery. Aldrin remarked that moving from sunlight into Eagle's shadow produced no temperature change inside the suit, but the helmet was warmer in the sunlight, so he felt cooler in shadow. The Mesa failed to provide a stable work platform and was in shadow, slowing work somewhat. As they worked, the moonwalkers kicked up gray dust which soiled the outer parts of their suits. The astronauts planted the lunar flag assembly containing a flag of the United States on the lunar surface, in clear view of the TV camera. Aldrin remembered, "Of all the jobs I had to do on the moon, the one I wanted to go the smoothest was the flag raising." But the astronauts struggled with the telescoping rod and could only insert the pole about 2 inches into the hard lunar surface. Aldrin was afraid that it might topple in front of TV viewers, but gave a crisp West Point salute. Before Aldrin could take a photo of Armstrong with the flag, President Richard Nixon spoke to them through a telephone radio transmission, which Nixon called the most historic phone call ever made from the White House. Nixon originally had a long speech prepared to read during the phone call, but Frank Borman, who was at the White House as a NASA liaison during Apollo 11, convinced Nixon to keep his words brief. I will now read the transcript from that historic phone call. Nixon: "Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Office at the White House. And this certainly has to be one of the most historic telephone calls ever made from the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure they too join with the Americans in recognizing what an immense feat this is. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to earth." Armstrong replies, "Thank you, Mr. President. It's great honor and privilege for us to be here, representing not only the United States, but men of peace of all nations, and with interest and a curiosity, and men with a vision of the future. It's an honor for us to be able to participate here today." Nixon: "Thank you very much, and I look forward, all of us look forward, to seeing you on the Hornet on Thursday." End transmission. They deployed the EASEP, which included a passive seismic experiment package used to measure moonquakes, and a retroreflector array used for the lunar laser ranging experiment. When Armstrong walked 196 feet from the LM to take the photographs at the rim of the Little West crater, while Aldrin collected 2 core samples. He used the geologist's hammer to pound in the tubes, the only time the hammer was ever used on Apollo 11, but was unable to penetrate more than 6 inches deep. The astronauts then collected rock samples using scoops and tongs on extended handles. Many of the surface activities took longer than expected, so they had to stop documenting sample collection halfway through the allotted 34 minutes. Aldrin shoveled 6 kilograms of soil into the box of rocks to pack them in tightly. 2 types of rocks were found in the geological samples: basalt and breccia. 3 new minerals were discovered in the rock samples collected by the astronauts: amarculite, tranquilite, and pyroferrite. Ferrite? I'm sure I said all that wrong. I do apologize. Amarculite was named after Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. All have subsequently found on Earth. While on the surface, Armstrong uncovered a plaque mounted on the LM ladder bearing 2 drawings of Earth, of the western and eastern hemispheres, an inscription, and signatures of the astronauts and President Nixon. The inscription read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." At the behest of the Nixon administration to add a reference to God, NASA included the vague date as a reason to include AD, which stands for Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. Mission Control used a coded phrase to warn Armstrong his metabolic rates were high and that he should slow down. He was moving rapidly from task to task as time ran out. As metabolic rates remained generally lower than expected for both astronauts throughout the walk, Mission Control granted the astronauts a 15-minute extension. In a 2010 review, Armstrong explained that NASA limited the first moonwalk's time and distance because there was no empirical proof of how much cooling water the astronauts' PLSS backpacks would consume to handle their body heat generation while working on the moon. Lunar ascent. Aldrin entered Eagle first. With some difficulty, the astronauts lifted film and 2 sample boxes containing 21.55 kilograms of lunar surface material to the LM hatch, using a flat cable pulley device called Lunar Equipment Conveyor. This proved to be an inefficient tool, and later missions preferred to carry equipment and samples up to the LM by hand. Armstrong reminded Aldrin of a bag of memorial items in his sleeve pocket, and Aldrin tossed the bag down. Armstrong then jumped onto the ladder's 3rd rung and climbed into the LM. After transferring to LM life support, the explorers lightened the ascent stage for the return to lunar orbit by tossing out their PLSS backpacks, lunar overshoes, an empty Hasselblad camera, and other equipment. The hatch was closed again at 0511. They then pressurized the LM and settled down to sleep. Presidential speechwriter William Safire had prepared an "in event of moon disaster" announcement for Nixon to read in the event the Apollo 11 astronauts were stranded on the moon. The remarks were in a memo from Safire to Nixon's White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, in which Safire suggested a protocol the administration might follow in reaction to such a disaster. According to the plan, Mission Control would close down communications with the LM, and a clergyman would commend their souls to the deepest of the deep, in a public ritual likened to burial at sea. The last line of the prepared text contained an allusion to Rupert Brooke's World War I poem, "The Soldier." The script for the speech does not make a reference to Collins, as he remained on board the Columbia in orbit around the moon. It was expected that he would be able to return to the module to Earth in the event of a mission failure. While moving inside the cabin, Aldrin accidentally damaged the circuit breaker that would arm the main engine for liftoff from the moon. There was a concern that this would prevent firing of the engine, stranding them on the moon. The non-conductive tip of a Duro felt-tip pen was sufficient to activate the switch. After more than 21.5 hours on the lunar surface, in addition to scientific instruments, the astronauts left behind an Apollo 1 mission patch in memory of astronauts Roger Chaffee, Gus Grissom, and Edward White, who died when their command module caught fire during a test in January of 1967. 2 memorial medals of Soviet cosmonauts Vladimir Komarov and Yuri Gagarin, who died in 1967 and 1968 respectively. A memorial bag containing a gold replica of an olive branch as a traditional symbol of peace, and a silicon message disc carrying the goodwill statements by Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, along with messages from leaders of 73 countries around the world. The disc also carries a listing of the leadership of the U.S. Congress, a listing of members of the 4 committees of the House and Senate responsible for NASA legislation, and the names of NASA's past and then current top management. After about 7 hours of rest, the crew was awakened by Houston to prepare for the return flight. At the time, unknown to them, some 100 kilometers away from them, the Soviet probe Luna 15 was about to descend and impact. Despite having been known to be orbiting the moon at the same time, through a groundbreaking precaution goodwill exchange of data, the mission control of Luna 15 unexpectedly hastened its robotic sample return mission, initiating descent in an attempt to return before Apollo 11. Just 2 hours before Apollo 11's launch, Luna 15 crashed at 1550, with British astronomers monitoring Luna 15 and recording the situation. One commented, "I say, this really has been drama of the highest order, bringing the space race to its culmination." Roughly 2 hours later, at 1754, the Apollo 11 crew on the surface safely lifted off in Eagle's ascent stage to rejoin Collins aboard Columbia in the lunar orbit. Film taken from LM ascent stage upon liftoff from the moon reveals the American flag planted some 25 feet from the descent stage, whipping violently in the exhaust of the ascent stage engine. Aldrin looked up in time to witness the flag topple. The ascent stage of the LM separated. I was concentrating on the computers, and Neil was studying the attitude indicator, but I looked up long enough to see the flag fall over. Subsequent Apollo missions planted their flags further from the LM. Eagle rendezvoused with Columbia at 2124 on July 21st, and the two docked at 2135. Eagle's ascent stage was jettisoned into lunar orbit at 2341. Just before the Apollo 12 flight, it was noted that Eagle was still likely to be orbiting the moon. Later, NASA reports mentioned that Eagle's orbit had decayed, resulting in it impacting in an uncertain location on the lunar surface. In 2021, however, some calculations show that the lander may still be in orbit. Moving on to our video game. Outer Wilds is a 2019 adventure video game developed by Mobius Digital and published by Annapurna Interactive. The game follows the player character as they explore a planetary system stuck in a 22-minute time loop that resets after the sun goes supernova and destroys the system. Through repeated attempts, they investigate the alien ruins of the Nomai to discover their history and the cause of the time loop. The game began development in 2012 as director Alec Beecham's master thesis. He was inspired to create a game focused on exploration in which the player character was not the center of the game world. Beecham led a small team in building the game, first as an independent project, then as a commercial game at Mobius after the project won the Excellence in Design and Samua's McNally Grand Prize Award at the 2015 Independent Games Festival. Annapurna joined the project as a publisher in 2015 and funded its expansion beyond a student project. Outer Wilds was released for Windows, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4 in 2019. For PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series XS in 2022, and for Nintendo Switch in 2023. An expansion which explores further themes in a new location in the planetary system, Echoes of the Eye, was begun in 2019 and released for the same platforms in 2021. Outer Wilds was positively received upon release, which most critics acclaimed its design and some criticizing the uneven difficulty of gameplay and pursuing the game's mysteries. Echoes of the Eye was also positively received, with some of the criticism for introduction of horror elements. Outer Wilds was featured in several Game of the Year lists for 2019, as well as Game of the Decade lists, and won multiple categories at award shows, including the Best Game Award at the 16th British Academy Games Awards. Gameplay: Outer Wilds is an action-adventure video game set in a small planetary system in which the player character, an unnamed space explorer, referred to as the Hatchling, explores and investigates its mysteries in a self-directed manner. Whenever the Hatchling dies, the game resets to the beginning. This happens regardless after 22 minutes of gameplay due to the sun going supernova. The player uses these repeated time loops to discover the secrets of the Nomai, an alien species that has left ruins scattered throughout the planetary system, including why the sun is exploding. A downloadable content expansion, Echoes of the Eye, adds additional locations and mysteries to the game. The hatchling move around the game's space by walking and jumping. If they are wearing their spacesuit, they may also use the jetpack to propel themselves upwards. The spacesuit has a limited supply of fuel, which can be refilled at specific locations, and a limited supply of oxygen, which is refilled when the hatchling is near trees. If the player runs out of fuel, they can use oxygen as a propellant. Running out of oxygen, hitting an object or surface too hard, or being crushed will injure the hatchling or damage their suit, killing them if too much injury is sustained. While wearing the spacesuit, an interface showing the remaining fuel and oxygen is shown. Damage to the hatchling is shown by their suit icon turning red, with no explicit health amount given. The hatchling also has a signal scope, which can be used to scan for the source of audio transmissions. The hatchling can also freely fly a small spacecraft throughout the planetary system. The spacecraft and the celestial bodies of the system follow an exaggerated system of Newtonian physics, using the planets and other bodies to swiftly orbit the sun and exert their own variable gravity fields, and requiring the player to counteract their own momentum to slow down while flying. Collisions can damage parts of the spacecraft and make them inoperable. Too much damage can destroy it and kill the player, but can otherwise be repaired by exiting the spacecraft and interacting with the damaged components. Both the spacecraft and the spacesuit can launch a small probe to light up in an area or take pictures. The player character can only carry a single object at a time. Nothing is brought back with the hatchling when the time loop resets, with the exception of data on the spacecraft's computer, which displays the information and mysteries that the player has found so far, organized either by location or in a web of connections. Locations evolve throughout the duration of the time loop, such as parts of a planet collapsing or sand flowing from one area to another, making some areas only accessible from certain points in the time loop. Other people throughout the planetary system can be communicated within text-based dialogue trees, while Nomai writing, found in their ruins and represented as branching tree messages, can be read with a translator tool. The development of Outer Wilds began late 2012 as Alex Beecham's thesis for his master's degree at USC Interactive Media and Games Division. Beecham was the creative director for the project, which he developed along with other students from USC and student artists from Laguna College of Art and Design and Atlantic University College. Beecham reused elements from previous projects at the school, including a planetary system changing over time, a planet falling apart, and trees that moved when they were not observed. His goal was a game where the player could engage in space exploration in an open system that changed over time, with the primary goal being the exploration itself rather than traditional gameplay elements like resources or conquering. The game universe was designed not to be centered on the player, in that it continued to change whether or not the player was present or performing actions. He was inspired by the spirit of space exploration in an uncontrollable environment in the films Apollo 13 from 1995 and 2001 A Space Odyssey from 1968, and took cues from The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker 2002, non-player characters that would tell tales of distant lands to entice the player to explore those areas for themselves, and the sense of impending doom of The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, which is one of my favorite Legend of Zelda games, by the way. Initially unsure of where to start, he was encouraged by a fellow student to make an emotional prototype of the game that he wanted to make. The result was a short sequence of the player roasting a marshmallow over a campfire while the sun explodes above them. Beecham kept this as the core of the game thereafter, representing the theme of the differences in scale between forces outside the character's control and the small moments they could focus on instead. At the conclusion of his thesis, the game had the core gameplay mechanics of the player exploring a planetary system until the sun explodes and resets the time loop, along with the central puzzle of the time loop itself and the planets that were included in the final game. After graduating in 2013, Beecham took a job at the newly formed Mobius Digital, founded by his classmate Leon Verneuil, who had worked on the Outer Wilds project, and actor Masai Oka. Several other members of the development team were hired by Mobius as well, as Oka had seen the game at a USC exhibition and was impressed by their work. There, they worked on mobile games, while continuing to work on Outer Wilds as a side project. Beecham also made a text-adventure version of the game to prototype the story and mystery aspect of the game, which he publicly released in 2024. The team submitted Outer Wilds to the 2015 Independent Games Festival, where it won the Excellence in Design and Summa's McNally Grand Prize Awards, and received honorable mention for the Excellence in Narrative and Nouveau Award categories. In response to its positive reception, Mobius took the game on as a development project, with the aim of spending a year polishing it to a commercial game for Windows. Mobius launched a crowdfunding campaign for the game on Fig, the platform's first, raising $125,000 US. Beecham continued as a creative director for the game, with Verneuil as the designer, Logan Verhoef, and Jeffrey Yu as programmers, and Beecham's sister Kelsey as a writer. Mobius additionally hired an art director, Wesley Martin, who had initially seen the game at IGF. During this second phase of development, the team focused on creating a unified art style for the game and refining the design, but due to the time and budget constraints, did not try to expand the game's size or increase the visual quality beyond IGF version. Mobius later stated in 2024 that they did not expect the game would reach a wide audience and would likely result in closure of the studio, but that it could not afford to create a more complete and polished game. During that year of development, Annapurna Interactive approached the studio to be a publisher, buying out the investment and rights from Fig. The original investors on the game received a 245% return on their investment. Annapurna, in turn, pushed for the game to be more polished than a student project, and the development timeline was extended, delaying the planned launch from 2016 to 2018. This This was later delayed to 2019, with the game also planned for release on the Xbox One. Mobius began work with Section Studios, a video game art company, to develop concept art for the revamped game. The two companies went through several iterations of design prototypes, while Mobius built development tools before they aligned on a coherent aesthetic, and Mobius developed a vertical slice of Giant's Deep for Annapurna. Mobius then hired an in-house art team and built the rest of the game as the last phase of development. Outer Wilds was released digitally on PC and Xbox One on May 28, 2019. In exchange for additional financial support, the game was initially a timed exclusive on the Epic's Game Store, delaying support for a Linux version. A PlayStation 4 version was released on October 15, 2019, a PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and Series S version on September 15, 2022, and a Nintendo Switch version on December 7th of 2023. A physical PlayStation 4 version was released by Limited Run Games in 2020, and physical PlayStation 5 and Switch versions were planned for release as part of collector's editions by I Am 8-Bit and HappyNet in 2024. A concept art book with developer commentary, Field Guide to the Outer Wilds, was released in 2024. The game heavily employs a camping motif, reflecting Beecham's personal interest in backpacking while also emphasizing that the player character is far from their home and alone in space. Martin combined this with his childhood in Santa Cruz Mountains to make a visual design for Timber Hearth of a redwood forest, which was expanded to give many of the planet's designs based on specific areas. Timber Hearth is based on Yellowstone National Park, the Sequoia National Park, and Mount Rainier. Brittle Hollow is based on Iceland and Greenland, and Giant's Deep is loosely based on Santa Cruz's beach cliffs. The Outer Wilds space program aesthetic follows a design of camping in space and combines a rustic camping site with the aesthetic of NASA in the 1960s and 1970s. To help direct players, the art design is not uniformly detailed, with less detail present where there is nothing defined. This is intended to train players to not exhaustively check every area in order to steer them toward the paths the team wanted them to find first and not hidden shortcuts or empty areas. The writing of the game was designed by Kelsey Beecham to take the player on the same journey that the Nomai had taken, with the branching writing based on her own note-taking style. As the player's journey is self-guided, they are not forced to read any of the writing at a specific time or order, so the writing is designed to first interest the player and let them take in information at their own pace. It is constructed to be a major part of the gameplay loop, as learning new things is the only feedback the player gets. To that end, it is composed of a set of smaller mysteries, which each encourage exploration to solve and reward the player with new knowledge more often than fewer, larger mysteries would. In order to incentivize players to read the text, Beecham wrote conversations between strongly defined personalities and made sure that conversations would not contain only background lore, unrelated to the game's mysteries, so that players would expect it was all valuable, important content that should not be skipped. As players could find writings out of linear order, each conversation needed to hint to the player where previous conversations could be found, as well as what the Nomai writers planned to do next and where. The music of the game was composed by Andrew Prothlow, sorry if I said your name wrong, who had worked with Beecham previously. The central motif was based on sitting around a campfire, coming from Beecham's emotional core of the game. Prahlo joined the project in 2012 and began with a simple melody on a banjo as a campfire song, and expanded the music from there. He gave each of the other Outer Worlds explorers an instrument based on their personality, with the concept that they were all playing the same song apart but still together. This can be heard in-game with the signal scope, when the 5 planets with the Outer Wilds members are lined up. The music was written alongside the game's story, allowing it to grow and change as the story was refined, resulting in a unified theme about the joy of life and its bittersweet journey. Prahlo did not write general background music, so that music would only play when the player was in a location where it would be noticeable and meaningful. The title theme was both the first and last song written, as Prahlo recorded himself playing banjo music at the beginning of the development and again at the very end to symbolize the growth and change over the course of the game's creation. A soundtrack album for the game, Outer Wilds, was released on June 1st, 2019, with a vinyl version, Signals from the Outer Wilds, released in 2020. I chose to use the game Outer Wilds as the comparative media because the vehicle the player uses as their spacecraft looks much like a poor man's lunar lander. Other than flying around to other planets, the landing operation seems very similar to me, where you look through the bottom camera in order to line up your landing. I was not personally very good at it. I oftentimes would bounce off my targets. Both the LEGO Lunar Lander and Outer Wilds also came out in the year 2019. This was my first time playing the game myself, after hearing so many good things about it from others. This puzzle-solving game is very intriguing and enjoyable for me. It is a free roaming game, so it's up to the player to decide on what direction and goals you want to accomplish. I only got stuck twice, where I had to look something up, not because I didn't know what to do, but because there was such a small margin for error that I wasn't sure if I was doing it right in order to solve the issue. Our total build time today is 2 hours, 30 minutes, and 58 seconds. I highly recommend playing Outer Wilds for yourself. Remember to like, subscribe, share, ring that bell, all the things for the YouTubes. Thank you.